Hello everybody and welcome back to the studio. Today we're going to be painting birch trees and you're going to learn a lot about tone and composition and form and technique in this painting. We'll be scraping and we'll be adding a little resist and generally learning a lot about the different ways to approach a painting. So let's go over to the table and see what we can start with today. Okay, so here's our subject. This is what we're going to be painting, and let's go in a little bit more closely so we can see what's happening on the subject. So we have a birch forest here. We have a feeling of a foreground. It's a snowy winter scene, so there's snow on the foreground. There are shadows here, and the birch trees are located in different positions in the composition. And that's what I wanted to talk a little bit about today, because composition is really important. But before we start that, we're going to look at the tools that we need to paint this particular painting. So initially we're going to need a number 8, a number 10, and a number 6 brush. Those are pretty much the standard brushes for this size of painting. We're also going to need a flat brush perhaps for a little correction, also because it has an angled end, and we can use that to apply the liquid latex. So let's put those together. There's also a 1/4 inch. This is a 1/2 inch flat brush. You could use a 1/4 inch flat brush for that if you prefer. And it has a slightly narrower end. The other way to apply the liquid latex is to use an old synthetic brush. Please don't use your good watercolor brushes for this because it's very difficult to get the latex out of the brush when you've finished. If you are going to use the small synthetic brushes, then what you need to do is to put a little soap on the brush first, and that gives you a fighting chance of getting the frisket or liquid latex off the brush afterwards. Then when you rinse it in a different container of water than you would use for rinsing your brushes when you're painting. So let's put those to one side. There is a tool that you can use to remove the latex. It's called a rubber cement pickup, and it's useful. You can also remove the latex with your finger if you don't have this tool, so we'll put those to one side for the moment. You might need just a touch of white paint to add in a few little extra accents of white at the end of the painting. And this is a white gouache, which is an opaque watercolor. So I'm going to put that to one side for when we need it. We'll put the brushes away, and scraping tool you'll need too today for scraping some of these areas back here. So you can either use the end of the brush, or you could use a credit card that has been cut into different shapes for making this scraping. Scraping helps to make our lighter area over a darker background, and that's what we're using it for today. So let's take this off, and we'll take a look at our source material and just look at that and talk a little bit about that and how and why we should use it. Okay, so when we're using a source material, particularly with a subject that goes way above our head, the camera can't cope with that. The camera lens can't cope with keeping these trees straight as they go way up, except when they're right in front of you. So what happens, particularly on the edges, is that you get something called parallax, where everything angles. So you've probably seen this on buildings, where buildings go up and they almost meet at the top when they're way taller than you are. If you paint your subject the way it is in the photograph like this, then it's obvious that you're painting from a photograph and you're not in front of the scene. So you need to know that you can correct that parallax by straightening the trees like this just a little bit when you paint. When you paint from photographs, it's a good idea not to copy the photograph exactly. It's a good idea to interpret it in many ways. There are very few photographs that have perfect compositions, so you want to make your own composition from that photograph. Also, it's a good idea to leave out some of the things that you see there. It's not really necessary in this particular painting to have these clouds in the sky and to have these trees lower down, because everything is divided in half. So we've kind of got half of the painting here, the shapes that go across there, and the other half of the painting there. Good idea, and a better idea actually, to always divide your format into thirds like this. Either way, thirds going this way, thirds going this way, and thirds going this way. So we have a third going across there, and we have a third coming down here and here. The reason for the thirds is to help you place and locate the subject so that you have a more interesting composition. So using the thirds to put interesting and important parts of the composition is a very good idea. This tree is placed pretty much on the third that goes across here, the division of thirds. This tree here is placed on that division too. And by doing that, we can keep the viewer's interest in the areas that we want them to see in the painting. Birch trees often are located in or found in groups, in clumps. So it's a good idea to maybe make a clump here on the third, maybe a single tree here, maybe a couple of trees together. And one of the other things you want to be really careful about when you're doing multiple subjects like this that are pretty much the same, each one is a tree and each one is the same, we have a tendency to repeat the shapes across the format and to repeat the spaces between the shapes across the format. So you've really got to force yourself not to do that. This space is a different proportion than this space. This space is a different proportion from this space. All the way through, there's a variety of proportions. And you'll find that the trees do not finish at the same place all the way along the bottom. They're much more interesting if they're staggered. So those are two areas of this particular subject and of any subject. And when things line up and they're equidistant, we tend to call them, or I tend to call them soldiers. So we don't want any soldiers in our painting. We want areas that are not as defined and areas that are more varied. Okay, so a narrow space and a wider space, a wider tree and a narrower tree will give us more interest in the final painting. So when you're making your drawing, be aware of that and be aware that it happens very with Frisket. This comes with lots of names. It's called Resist, it's called Frisket, it's called Liquid Latex, it's called Misket, it's called all sorts of things. What you want to do is not to shake it. You want to stir it with the back end of your brush. The reason you don't want to shake it is because if you have to use it on large areas and you shake it, it will have a lot of bubbles. They will open up as it dries and you'll have to repeat the process. So trying to get out of the habit of shaking it. And what I'm doing now is I'm just applying this with the brush. If you apply it with the brush, it'll dry just a little faster than if you apply it with the end of the brush, but either one will work. So for speed, I'm just applying it with the latex brush. And I'm not being too careful about this because these trees are varied and I don't necessarily want them all to be exactly the same shape, size, edges. So I'm varying the way that I put the Frisket on. I also varied the drawing so that they weren't perfect and I didn't outline everything really tightly. And so once you have the idea, then you can go ahead and start this. And it'll take just a few minutes for these to dry. And by the time I've finished and you've done your Frisket, we'll be ready to go on to the next part of the painting. So I'll put this on pretty quickly. It's a warm day today. It's going to dry fast. Doesn't need to be very thick. Just a thin layer is fine. Okay, now that one got to be just a little too wide there. And I'm going to show you how to fix that later on if that happens. Don't try to lift it while it's wet because it'll just smudge and make a big mess. Best to leave it to dry and then you can take it off. And you can also fix the issues that you have with Frisket, which are many, when you take it off after the painting is dry or after the Frisket is dry. So the other thing that you have to be really careful about with Frisket is not to leave it on the paper too long. A week or so is about as long as you should leave it. And never to put it out in the sun to dry or leave it in a hot car because that will cook the Frisket onto the surface and it will be very difficult to get off after that. I'm just going to turn this sideways now so I can do these. So you just have to watch for those few issues. And it's a very useful tool for saving the white paper. And that's the reason we're using it, is to protect this white paper while we paint the rest of the painting so that the birch trees stay white and then we can paint them at the end when we've done everything else. It's very, very useful for that. It's useful for certain subjects, but it does have its disadvantages, and the main disadvantage is that it has very sharp edges after you take off the subject and take off the frisket. So sometimes that can be a bit of a pain to deal with, but we'll see how that goes today. Just a little bit more down there. Don't put any on the snow. We don't need to do that, just the trees. Okay, so go ahead and put your frisket on the trees, and I'll give you a few minutes to do that, and then this will be dry by then. We'll rinse this off in a separate container, and we'll be good to go. Then we can take a look at some of the colors that we're going to use while your frisket is drying. And while you're doing that, I'm just going to demonstrate on the back of this little painting here how you would put this on with the end of the brush. Okay, so the end of the brush is angled, and you dip it in the frisket, and then you just draw it on very carefully and just spread it out lightly. Now what you don't want to do is to push and grind the brush onto the surface of the paper. You only need to spread it very, very, very lightly. I'm hardly touching the paper here when I put this on, because you'll find that if you go very hard like this and you push on it and you spread it across like that, that it will be difficult to remove, and you'll get blue lines within the painting, and you don't want that. Okay, so very, very lightly you can use the side of the brush just to spread it a little bit. Side of the end of the brush just to spread it a little bit. You can use the narrow part backwards to make thin lines. So this is a very, very useful tool, and the advantage is that it has really easy cleanup, and you can use it over and over again. The disadvantage is that it takes longer to dry. So if you have more time, it's fine. If you're working to a time limit and you want the frisket to dry sooner, then the synthetic brush is probably a good idea. So we'll put that away for the moment till we need it later on. Okay, so we're almost dry here now, and I'm sure by now you've got most of your trees covered. So now we're going to look at some of the colors that we need for this painting. Now, one of the things you need to make sure you're doing in watercolor all the time is making certain that the surface of your paint is moist. And so I'm using my spray bottle all the time when I'm painting to make sure that the surface of the paint is really, really wet. These paints are not really intended, the tube paints are not intended to be used dry. And also, if you use them when they're too dry, you're just wearing out your brushes. And so always, you can let them dry out between painting sessions, no problem. But make sure you wet them up again quite significantly a little time before you start to paint, so that when you touch the paint, it's very soft and it feels just as though it's coming from the tube. Okay? So we're going to use just 3 colors today, a limited palette, because we don't need too many other colors to make what we need in this particular subject. The 3 colors are the 2 blues. The 2 blues are darker blue. Ultramarine is the darker blue that kind of leans towards purple. And Prussian blue is the darker blue that leans towards turquoise, or towards green if you like. So those 2 blues. And the 3rd color that we're going to use for this painting is burnt sienna. Now with those colors we can make a variety of browns and grays and warm tones, cool tones, depending on how we do it. We can also make black if we need to. So pretty good range of colors. These colors are also complementary, so they are found opposite each other on the color wheel. This is like an orange, right? An orange brown, and the blues are on the opposite side. So when we mix them together, they're going to neutralize each other and gray each other down. And that's one of the advantages of the complementary colors and using complementary colors in the painting to do that. Okay, so now we know the colors we're using. We need to know how much paint to put in and how much water. And that's always a little tricky. Let me just identify these on here for you first. This is ultramarine blue. This is Prussian blue. And you can see the difference more on the paper perhaps. And this is burnt sienna. Okay. Now, I use the tape around the painting. This is a masking tape that comes from the hardware store, and it's used for delicate surfaces. It's the one that they use for delicate surfaces, so it won't tear your paper. It happens to just be, fortunately for us, a light middle tone. So it gives us an idea of how dark or how light the paint is if we compare the color of the tape with the color of the paint. It's very, very useful at the beginning of the painting to give you an idea of how dark your color is in relation to the white paper, because pretty much everything we put on the paper initially looks darker than it is. Okay, so if you don't remember that, and if you don't paint just a little more darkly than you think you need initially, you'll just have to repaint everything, and that's not really what we want to do, because then we lose the freshness of watercolor. So we're going to be comparing these colors as we mix them with this tape to get an idea of how dark and how light we want our colors to be. So let's take a look at the source material again. We've got a nice blue sky here. You could use just straight ultramarine for that if you want to, or you can mix the two blues together to get that variety of blue that you're seeing there. Pretty strong colored sky. I don't know if we need it quite that dark. It's up to you. I didn't paint it quite that dark in this one, but if you want a darker sky, you can. We're probably going to go to a middle tone for the sky. So that means that we have to add some water to the paint as it comes from the tube, but not too much. I'm going to mix the two blues together so I can get a puddle. Now I need to have enough paint to be able to cover this whole area of sky. Okay, so make sure, that's the other thing that we don't do much when we're first learning to paint, is make enough paint to go around. So let me mix up a little more paint just for the sky. And then we're also going to need the paint for the background trees at the same time. Okay, now I'm going to add just a little more water to that. I have a nice big puddle there, and I'm going to test it against the tape here. And that's about the right color for the sky, okay? Bearing in mind that it's going to dry lighter, always dries lighter. So it's looking a little more turquoise up on my screen, but it's a mixture of the two blues. Okay, so the other color that we're going to need in this first wash that we put down, and we're going to need also the scrapers for this. We're going to need our two brushes. The other color we'll need is a brown, and it doesn't have to be too dark just yet. It can be a lightish brown, like this brown here, a sort of orange brown. And so to get that color, I'm going to add some burnt sienna and ultramarine blue together. Okay, so this is the ultramarine blue going into the burnt sienna. I'm putting a little bit more blue in because I need a bigger puddle of color. And now I'll add more burnt sienna to that. And we'll push it towards an orange brown. There we go. That's a good one to go with. Okay. And we're also going to need a slightly darker brown for the base. Right? So that's probably a good one initially for the orange brown. And now as we come down in the painting, down to the bottom here, we're going to need something just a little darker. So I'll lighten that one up just a wee bit and make it just a little bit lighter. We'll test it on the paper. And yes, it's a sort of light orange brown. That's good. Okay, and now we're going to mix up a slightly smaller amount, again with ultramarine and burnt sienna, of a darker brown. Now, a darker brown just means that you use less water and less brown, less burnt sienna. Okay, so that gives us a darker brown, and we'll test that against the bottom here. Okay, so we've got our sky color, we've got our mostly trees color, this one here, and those are bigger puddles of color, and the smaller color with just a little less water is the darker brown that we're going to put in here. Now this is a big wet in wet wash that we're going to do all the way across the painting. We have to have everything ready to go before we start, because if we don't, we won't be able to scrape out these white trees, and we won't be able to put in a little bit of extra dark down here. These final darks at the bottom here will be added later. Okay, we can do those later. That's not as important to do them now. Okay, so we also need a tool for scraping ready to go, and that would be the flat end of the brush, or the angled end of the brush, or a credit card. All right, so have those ready to go before you start to paint. I'm going to switch over to a number 10 brush to put this first layer of paint on, because a number 10 brush will hold a lot more paint than a number 8 brush. And so I'll be able to make the painting stay wet longer. It's a little warm in here this afternoon, so I want to make sure I have enough water in the paint to keep it damp. Okay, so once you're ready to go with your colors, then you'll be able to start this painting. Sometimes when it's really warm, I wet the paper first because that gives us a little extra time to spend working on the techniques that we're using. So I'm going to do that today. I'm going to wet the paper up just a little bit before I start, just with water. And that's going to make the paint just a wee bit lighter overall, but it's going to give us a little bit more time to work with those techniques that we need to use in this background. So just a little bit, don't make it too shiny. Spread it out. And we have just a little bit of water on there. You can see just a tiny bit of shine on there. Okay, now that gives us time to apply the paint. We'll just let it sink in for a second or two. There you go, that's going down. Now when the shine disappears, that's always a good time to use a lot of the techniques. And the technique that we're using today is scraping in this particular area. And we want to do that when it's not too wet. So let's put a little sky in here now. Start with that idea. Okay, sky can go all the way down, a little bit further. If you find that your sky is a little darker than you would like, remember this is going to dry lighter. Lighter also because of the water on the paper. So I'm okay with this. When I squint and look at it, it's lighter than the tape. Okay, so it's going to dry lighter than that as it dries. So that will be fine. Bring the sky down just a little bit. And then let's make some tree shapes at the top here. With this second wash, the wash that has a little bit more orange in. And what we're doing is we're emulating what we see here in the top of the trees. We're seeing the top version. So you can leave your sky shapes, any shape you like, and you can bring in some tree shapes. And these top edges now are going to be really soft and they'll disappear into the distance because they are background trees. It's exactly what we want. We don't want them to interfere too much with the forest that we're painting, the birch forest that we're painting on front. Let's see if we can make that silhouette at the back here as interesting as possible. Some should be taller. Again, some should be shorter. They shouldn't be exactly the same height all the way across. Okay, so we'll make this one just a little bit taller. We'll make this one just a little bit shorter. We can raise that one up a little bit and pull it down into the bottom just a wee bit more. Okay, now as soon as you've got that in, and that's working pretty nicely, just bring a bit more color in there, then the bottom part of the painting can be this darker brown tone that we've got in here. Looks like a lot of contrast right now, but it's going to dry lighter. So we just want a little bit of this in here all the way across the base, down to the snow area, which was our horizon that we decided to put in there. And that horizon is about on the third too. So just think about that when you're drawing this subject. Okay. All right, so we have a nice interesting edge that is not too straight. Again, it doesn't go straight across, it goes meanders in and out a little bit. We have a lighter version of the color. I'm going to add a tiny bit more of the lighter brown up here because it's drying out just a little bit too light. So just add a touch more of that while it's still wet. We need to keep this wet, and you need to be watching right now to make sure that you can see exactly what's happening here before you start. Okay, very important. Now, you can see that that's pretty shiny as I look at it from the side. Some of it's beginning to dry, but it's still pretty shiny. Now, all the while it's shiny like that, you don't want to scrape out, because if you do, your trees that you scrape out in the background are going to be dark. And I'll do a couple of those so you can see. because the paint will bleed back into those areas that you scrape. And so we're going to do what we can't do very easily in watercolor, and that's paint light over dark. And the reason we're going to, the way that we're going to do it is to lift out some of the dark paint so we get back almost to the white paper. So we can use the smaller of the brushes to do that. And scraping with the side of the brush will give you, a smaller brush will give you a small line. Let me just go in a little bit closer so you can see what I'm doing there. And a wider brush will give you a wider line. Now this is what happens if it's too wet. What will happen is you will have a problem with the line continuing all the way up before the paint bleeds back. Now that's okay because we can have some darker trees in the background there. It's not a problem. But you need to know if you want it to be completely white or a little bit more white like this, you need to scrape just after the shine disappears. And that's your window of opportunity. In watercolor, there are a few windows of opportunity, and that's one of them. Also a good idea to have a surface that is firm when you're scraping, okay? So you can put it on a book or something like that. So here's one that I scraped out, and the top of it's still too wet. Can you see that? So the top of it's going to be darker, which is also okay. But if you're getting this sort of effect when you're scraping, it's because the paint is too wet. So I'm going to do a couple more little ones in here, going in different directions. Okay, we want a forest. And so we want a forest that has a lot of trees. And then I'll do a few bigger ones. I'm using a 1/2 inch and a 1/4 inch. But you could use just one of these. It doesn't really matter whether you use a large one or a small one. Okay, let's let them go up. And one over here, we could have another little one that starts higher and goes further. And then when it starts higher, it looks as though it's further back. And there's one that's going to be dark because it's just a little bit too wet. And here's another one in here, going to be darker too. This area here is still just a bit wetter. We'll do a larger one here, coming down a little bit further. So this is a great technique to use for grasses, when you need light grasses against dark grasses. It's a really good technique for trees like this, when you want a variety of trees that are lighter than the background. Okay, another one in here. And then we get a nice interest in the background. Okay, so we'll make these work a little bit better later on. But right now, this is what you need to do. So this is a scraping technique, and you can see I'm using the back of my brush, and I'm just angling it against the paper. So it's at about a 45-degree angle. And I'm using the sharp edge of the back of the brush, okay? Not this way around, not flat against the paper, the back side of the brush, and then the edge that's farthest away from me is the edge that I'm using to scrape with. And the other option is the credit card that you can use for this. Now I'm seeing that I've got some soldiers here right away by noticing that these are all on the same level. So I'm going to pull some of those down. And we can adjust that too with bushes along the bottom when we've finished. Okay, so your turn now to do that big wash. Start with the sky, then add in the lighter brown, and then the darker brown, and you'll see it's all dried a whole lot lighter than you thought it was going to be. Mostly because we wet the paper first. So be sure to wet the paper. Use a number 10 brush. Wet the paper down to the horizon before you start all the way across. And then add the lighter brown in, or after you've done the sky, put the sky in first, and then add the lighter brown in, and just let the edges vary along the top so you get a suggestion of the background of trees back there. And add your darker brown towards the bottom. It's not looking particularly darker up on the screen, but it's slightly darker than the top. It dries lighter because you're putting it on top of the wet surface, and that's why it's not looking quite as dark as it does here, because the water in the paper will dilute the paint just a little bit. So I'm going to stop for a few minutes and let you get on with that. And when you finish that, then we'll come back and we'll work on the next stage of this painting. Okay, so when you've got that finished now, the next stage that we're going to do before we think about taking off the frisket is to add in a few more dark brown bushes at the back here, because it'll be easier to do that with the frisket still on than later. And so I'm just adding in a few little bushes, and at this point I'm going to soften the bottom edge. So I'm using my number 8 brush. I can use a number 10 or a number 6 with just water on to make sure this edge is softer and feels a little bit more like a snowy edge back there. So we don't want a really sharp edge at the back here. This looks very dark on the screen, but as you know, it's going to dry lighter, and you can go around some of the trees and you can let some of them disappear into the background behind these bushes. So you have the choice of doing either of those. So let's just give a little bushy effect to the top edge of these. Let them connect together across the trees a little bit. And that looks really dark, but there's a lot of water in it. It's not going to dry that dark. And I'm softening off the edge so I get more of a snowy feel along that back edge. A looser feel. So it's not too sharp. See how sharp this is, and that doesn't make sense back there? It's going to be much more interesting if it's a softer, looser edge. And we just do that with a damp brush. Okay, let's vary that a little bit. And now these bushes can be lower down than those in this area. And then they can go just a little bit higher, maybe over here. It's important to have a lot of variety in your shapes when you're painting. Very, very important to do that. Okay. So again, I'm going to soften off this bottom edge now and make it really interesting to look at, soft and snowy. And let's have a nice big bush behind this big tree. That will work pretty nicely. There we go. And you can see how I've got a varied silhouette all the way across the back there. We really always have a tendency to paint things all the same. You have to force yourself not to do that. Force yourself to think about the idea that it's going to be more interesting for the viewer to look at if it's varied. So much more interesting. So really think about how that works. Now I'm letting some of the trees show at the bottom here, and I'm covering some of them up, again, because we want variety. And now we'll soften this back edge here. And just push it in and out a little bit so it has more interest. Maybe it can come down just a little bit more in that area. We'll add some more goodies back there later. But right now we're setting the scene for everything else. Okay, that's good. All right, so this was a brown that was just a little bit darker, just a touch darker than the one I used initially, but it's being painted on dry paper, and so therefore it looks sharper edged, and it will stay just a little darker. Just loosen this edge up a little bit more. Okay, that gives us a much better feel for that area now. Just push that out a little bit. That's a bit too straight. Take a look and see. All of the parts of your painting should have interest. So take a look and see what makes your painting at this point more interesting. Should you open it up a little bit like that, or should you just leave that straight line all the way across? And I'm looking at it and thinking, yeah, I could open that up a bit. That looks good. Okay, so that's going to give us some interest there. And while that's drying down a bit, I'm going to add just a little bit more of the warmer tone in between, in a few places in between, just for some variety and a different height of elements in there. And I'm painting them in between the white trees. Leave the white trees white. But I'm just going to put in just a little bit of stuff that we can imagine is another layer of bushes or trees back there. It's just a little interest in a different color, different tone. So again, the heights, this is really good practice for thinking about how tall everything should be, how short everything should be, how everything connects to everything else. It's a good subject for that. A little bit more of that. This is just the warmer brown that I used in the first layer. So I'll just have a little bit more of that. And when you paint wet onto dry like this, you're going to get sharper edges, and that's what we want here too. We want a little variety of the way the edges look. This is a soft edge up here. This is a sharp edge down here. We kind of want something in between in the background. And so this is how we are achieving it in this painting. We always want variety and interest in all the different areas that we're painting. And some of these trees in the background we're going to accent a bit more later. But right now we'll just paint around them. As you get more used to painting, you can actually do this part and the dark part in the first layer and then scrape out the trees. But that's an awful lot to do initially and much more difficult. So easier if we do it this way. Okay, tighten that up against some of the white trees down here so they pop out a bit more. And then we'll be okay with that part of the painting. So what we've done is given a middle ground here. Rather than just a completely flat forest, now we have layers of different elements going on in this forest, and that seems to work a lot better. It also gives us a few sharper edges to look at, and your eye is always going to be attracted to sharper edges, and soft edges allow your eye to flow over the painting, and so you want a variety of soft and sharp edges in every painting. Usually the sharper edges are going to be where you want the viewer to look first, and that's going to be the trees in this case. This is just the background that we're dealing with now, and this is going to be our support actor on the stage. Okay, the trees are going to be the stars in this one. So what we're achieving is something along the lines of this, okay, in our background. We've got a softer layer here, a very soft layer up there, and a slightly sharper layer at the bottom here. And you can also do more of this later if you want to. If you need to, or if you think you would like to, you can add more of these little darks in as accents, even after you've painted the trees. It's just a whole lot easier to put them in before you take off that liquid latex. Okay? So after you finish this, we're going to come back and we're actually going to work on some of the shadows on the ground while we wait for this to dry a little bit so that we can make that area more interesting too. Before I do that, I'm just going to add a couple more of these bushes just a little higher up. As I look at this, I'm thinking, well, maybe we could have a taller one right about there. Something a little bit taller. And possibly even over here. Something just a little bit taller. Just seems like they're a little bit too low down to the ground. That feels better. So it's your painting, you look at it, you trust your sense of judgment, because you all have a good sense of design, you should use it. And if it doesn't feel right, don't let it go like that. Fix it. See, sometimes it's hard to know what to put in to make it feel right though. And that's a learning process. Okay, I'm going to stop there. Now that seems to have a nice, interesting variety going through the back. So that's what I've been aiming for, and that's what you should aim for too. So I'll give you a few minutes to finish that off, and then we'll go straight into the foreground and see what we can do in there while we're waiting for that to dry down. Two layers. One is the warmer browner layer that we used in the background. It's the same paint, but this time it's being painted on top of dry paint, so it's going to end up being just a little darker. Make it interesting in shape and silhouette all the way along the back. Some of the branches from the trees in the foreground will go over this. A lot of the branches will go over this. And so it will be pushed back where it belongs when we start to paint the big trees. Okay, now let's go back and take a look at what the subject matter is offering us and how we can interpret this. And that's really what we're doing when we're painting. We're interpreting what we see. We could make a photographic reproduction of this, but it's more interesting if we put a little of ourselves into the painting and do a little interpretation. The painting is more interesting when you do that. And so what we're going to do now is we're going to look at the way the light is falling on these trees. And from the source material, we can see that the light comes from the left and goes across, okay, because this tree is much lighter on this side and much darker on that side. So that gives us that clue. Also, if you look at the shadows on the ground, you'll see that they are starting behind the trees and going out, and behind the tree here and going out. So this is what we're going to do now. We're going to paint some of these shadows on the snow. Can you see how they're not completely flat? They're horizontal, but they're not completely flat. Here's a little one that goes up and over the snow in the background there. Some of them will be flatter than others. And so you can vary that as much as you like. And I did a little bit of that in this painting, where I made the areas go down just a little bit and up just a little bit. And you can do that with your brush strokes. So we need a number 8 brush. And now we're going to go back to the palette and we're going to mix up a color for the shadows. And colors for shadows are usually grays. Grays work really well, particularly in this painting, because we have a lot of possibilities with making grays. One of the best ways to make a good gray is ultramarine blue and burnt sienna together. A little more blue than brown will give you a blue-gray, and a little bit more water in it will make it thinner for a shadow color, and that will look something like this. Okay, that's a pretty good shadow color. A little bit more brown in it will make it warmer, and that's another option if you want to. You can have a slightly warmer shadow color. It's a little bit more neutral. Okay, I prefer the blue, so I'm going to have just a bit more blue in here, but you might prefer it to be just a bit warmer. Let's check again. That looks like a pretty good shadow color. Now I'm going to put some lighter shadows on here to start with, and then I'm going to put some darker shadows. Now the shadow color should be about the same tone as the tape right now. Not too much lighter, not too much darker. If you squint at these colors, these 3 colors, and you squint at the tape, they're kind of the same color. This one might be slightly darker, but they're close. So we're going to put in some of the lighter shadows that go across the painting with this lighter tone, and we'll come back at the end and add in some darker shadows. So let's take a look at our source material again. And the shadows are going to be horizontal because the ground is flat. But you vary the ground by varying the shadows. Okay, so if we want the ground to go up just a little bit, let's go a bit closer so you can see what we're doing here. You want the ground to go up just a little bit, you put the shadow up just a little bit. And that indicates that the snow changes direction. And then it can come down and go across and go all the way through. Okay, so this is going to dry much lighter. And this one can go up just a little bit more. Most of the shadows are going to come from behind the tree. Okay. Some of the shadows are going to be wider, indicating more trees. And some of these trees have more than one shadow. This is the tree for this. This is the shadow for this tree, but this tree behind it is also going to cast a little shadow. And that could go through and that can make that one just a little bit thicker. This little tree here is going to have a little shadow too. And this one just a touch, perhaps coming that way. So let's just end up with a few shadows here, and then we can have a few just because we can, and just because it makes the painting more interesting. So we'll have a little shadow down here in the corner. And for this, I'm going to use my brush on its side and use something called dry brush, a technique that allows you to see a little bit more texture on the paper by using the side of the brush instead of the point of the brush. Okay, so a little dry brush here where I use the side of the brush to get a little texture will be kind of fun for that area. And a little bit more down there. Again, it's got to be varied. And snow isn't completely white ever. And so we will be putting a little bit of a warm tone on the snow before we finish. But it is kind of white in most places. We just don't want to save too much white. A little bit of dry brush back there. And that's probably going to do it. I don't think you need to do too much. These shadows are coming from trees that we can't see. Perhaps, we don't know, but perhaps they are, out of the painting. Okay, some of trees that are out of the... We're going to be adding some grasses and all sorts of other things in here yet. Okay, so go ahead and make your shadows now in this light tone to start with, and we'll be adding to these in a darker tone later. They're not too thick because the trees are pretty thin, and so they need to be relatively thin lines that go across here. That one can go just a little further across there. Need to link those two together, and we'll have that come across there, just a little bit thicker on that one. Okay, so that would be good to start with. Okay, once you've got those lighter shadows in, let's just put that to one side to finish drying off. We're going to look at a separate piece of paper here because I'm going to show you now the process of painting the trees. So we're just going to draw a tree in here. Each of these trees will be painted in the same way. Okay, each of them will be the same. And so we will add, back to the palette, we will add some paint in here because we need 3 colors for the trees, 3 tones for the trees. Let's go back and see what we need to mix for those. We're going to need a little gray for the back of the tree, and that gives us the shadow that we see back here. Okay, on the back side of the tree, it's going to give us that gray shadow. So we need enough paint mixed up to make a light-ish shadow, no darker than the tape. So let's mix up a little bit of that gray, and it's more like a blue-gray for these trees. Okay, just a little bit of a bluish gray. We'll test that on our paper and see how dark it is. That's just a wee bit too dark, so we'll add just a touch of water to it and test it again, and that's about right. Okay, so that's our shadow color. That happens on the side of the tree. In the middle of the tree, we're going to see a warm tone. Now that warm tone could be burnt sienna, or if in another painting you're using raw sienna, you could use that too. But we're not using that in this painting, so we'll use burnt sienna. This needs to be a pretty light tone. And the reason for doing this, and let's just test that on here and see first of all, just burnt sienna all by itself. The reason for adding burnt sienna in is because it's a warm tone, and warm tones tend to come forward and cooler tones tend to go backwards. And so when we paint with warmer and cooler tones, what happens is the cooler tone sits in the back of the painting, the back of the tree. Let's go a little closer so we can see. Right? The cooler tone sits here on the back side of the painting. If we add a warmer tone right next to it here, that tends to bring the front of the tree closer to us. And if we leave the left-hand side of the tree white, that will give us that dimension that we need to make the trees look as though they're round. Apart from the marks on the trees, this is actually a really good way of showing dimension. You might be able to see it a bit more clearly on this tree. And these two colors will bleed together a little bit. So the gray will go on first, the brown will go on afterwards, and then we'll soften the edge. Right? So this is the process for the trees, and each of the trees is going to be painted in the same way. So go back to the painting here. We've got the gray and the brown ready to go. I'm just giving you a sample here on the back of another piece of paper so you can see how this works. So each tree is going to be painted in the same way. Each tree is going to have gray on the back here. That looks awfully dark, but it's about right because it will dry lighter. Very quickly, before it has a chance to dry, and watercolor is always a hurry-up process because of that, we're going to add in just a little of the warm here. Don't lose the white on the left-hand side, but let that warm bleed into the gray. And then, before that has a chance to dry, we're just going to soften that edge a little bit, just with the point of the brush, very lightly, but don't lose the white on the other side of the tree. Okay, so you're coming in about a little over a third on this side. Okay, a little over a third with the gray, then the warm tone, and then the soft edge. Let's make sure that edge is soft all the way through. And the soft edge is just the point of the brush. And whenever you soften an edge, you should remember that you soften it from this side and not the side that you've already painted from. Okay, soften up to the edge rather than back from the edge. Okay, so each of the trees is going to have that same process right now. And it'll vary on each tree. So to do that, we have to take off the frisket. So we need to make sure the painting is completely dry before we do that. I have just a tiny little bit of wet in here in my dark brown, so I'm just going to use the hairdryer very high up just to finish off that drying in that small space down there. Just a tiny little bit, but still wet. You can use low heat high up if you want to, but don't use high heat low down to anything that has frisket on. Okay, so before we paint the trees now, and I'm going to do each of them the same, and I'll remind you as we go along, we're going to take off the frisket so that we can do that. Let's take our rubber cement pick up and just lift it up. Now sometimes this will just lift up and you can peel it off, and sometimes it's not quite thick enough for that. So just take this off quickly. This is just a little quicker than using your fingers to remove it. Do be sure your paint is dry before you take this off. I'm rushing just a little bit today so that you can see what's happening. And because of the time that we have. Now you can see some of those edges are not straight. Look, I have really odd edges here. I'm going to ignore those and correct them after I've painted the trees. Okay, so just imagine they're not there, paint over them, and we can correct them when we've finished. And that's going to happen every time you use frisket. You're going to get those edges that don't work the way that you thought they would when you put the frisket on. Okay, let's go back again, and I'm going to repeat how to do these trees. Right, you saw a little sample, so let's go a little bit closer. Good idea to start with a tree that's not as important till you get the hang of it, and then get to the big ones that are important along the way. So we're going to paint in the shadow about a third of the way, all the way across. About a third of the way, all the way down, I mean. Leave those little white edges, don't worry about those. That we can fix with the background color afterwards. Before this has a chance to dry, I'm still using a number 8 brush, even though it's a tiny tree, because I want to keep it wet for long enough. Put in a little bit of the burnt sienna right in the center of the tree, and then go back in sideways and just soften that edge with a damp brush. Be sure your brush is not too wet when you soften that, okay? So to get a damp brush, you rinse your brush in the water and then you put it on the sponge. And that way it'll just be damp. Okay, so we're going to do this with each one of the trees. So whenever you're ready, you can start, or if you need to watch again to see how it's done, I'm going to do the next one. The grey goes on the back side like this. It should look a little darker than you would like it to be initially, because that's how it's going to look. And the smaller trees, it doesn't need to go too far towards the center. And then a tiny touch of the burnt sienna. And if your brushes are not as pointed as mine, use a number 6 brush for this instead of a number 8. There we go. Okay, and now we'll go to the bigger one. And this can be just a little wider on the bigger one. Don't worry about those edges that didn't go where you want them to go. I know you want to fix everything. It's always a thing. I've got to get in there and fix it. Don't fix it. We can fix it later. All the fixing in watercolor is done when everything is dry. You can do a tremendous amount of fixing and changes when your paint is dry. Don't stop to do it now, because everything will dry and you won't get those nice soft edges that you need on this tree. Okay, and now we'll just soften the edge a little bit. And sometimes this little warm tone gets lost in the grey, and that's fine. It should connect with the grey, so it should be kind of lost in there. But it's enough to make it appear to be, to make the tree appear to be more rounded. Let's soften off that edge and soften it off there. And here. Okay, turn it sideways to soften it. It's much easier and quicker. And now I have to mix up some more paint. So go ahead and paint all your trees now in exactly the same way. It'll take a little while to do that. And then we'll come back and we'll work on the next stage. Remember, if you have to mix up more paint to test it and make sure it's the same, close to the same tone that you've been using. They don't have to be exactly the same. They can vary. Nothing is set in stone in watercolor. Okay, a little bit here. Now a little of the warm tone on the other side of that. And the warm tone connects with the grey and bleeds into it. And you have to work fast because everything dries very quickly. And then the third step is to soften the edge from the white side. And the white side is the left-hand side of the tree. And now what we're going to do is to fix a few of the areas in the background that are not working quite so well with the colors that you used in the background. You've still got some of those on your palette. So if it's in the middle tone area and it's a little space that is white and shouldn't be because the frisket wouldn't go on quite as straight as you wanted it to, now's a good time just to come back and repaint that with the background color. If it's dark brown, then you use the dark brown background color. If it's a little lighter, you use the lighter background color. So on this one here, I'm just going to fill in a couple of those little whites on the back of the tree. And if you're up in the sky, you can use a little of the sky color to do that. And then just spread it out a bit. And you'll find that it will kind of disappear back there and won't be an issue, right? Disappear into that area. So depending on whether you're working in the dark area or the middle tone area, use the same paint that you used the first time round. And so this one here needs just a little bit of that middle tone. And up here it's lighter, so I'll put it on and then just soften it off with a brush so it doesn't look too strong up there. And a little bit of light on that one too. So oftentimes this happens. You can't always make the frisket go exactly where you want it to go. And so you have to make some corrections along the way. And this is the way that you do it after you've painted. Okay, you can change the shape of the tree a little bit like that too if you want to. If your tree is a little wiggly and you'd like to, like here for example, it's a little too fat. So I'm going to change the shape by bringing some of the background color in and just connecting it with what's there. If you want to make it a bit wider, if you have a problem with it being too narrow, here for example, needs to go a little wider. Then you take your flat brush and wet it and just onto the sponge, soften it onto the sponge, dry it off a little bit onto the sponge, and then you can lift out a little edge here that is wider, that makes the tree feel a little better shaped. Okay, so the flat brush is really good for lifting, for taking things out. And here's one little area that's a bit too wide, so we'll just lose that down. So overall, your trees should look not too straight, but not too badly shaped. There we go, that should do it. A little bit more in here perhaps. So once you've tightened up the trees, down here I have a problem where this one got a little too wide. So I'm going to paint down and just connect it with the background. There we go. And the rest of them will be okay. They're varied enough to be okay. This one here just needs a little bit more of that dark. And this one could use just a touch of sky color up there. Okay, that should do it. So just a few corrections at this stage. Perhaps that's just a wee bit wide right about there. Okay, once you've done the corrections, then we're ready to put a little detail onto these trees. By now they should be dry. And the detail that we're going to put on are the markings on the trees. And there's a little perspective involved in those. And so I'm going to show you on my spare tree here that we painted how that perspective works. And I'm using a number 6 brush for the markings because we need them to be smaller. On a larger painting, I would use a larger brush. And that's something you need to remember. If you're going to make a larger version of this, you need to scale up your brushes a little bit, as well as the size of the subject. Okay, so the markings are dark brown, and dark brown, remember, is burnt sienna and ultramarine blue, okay, with not too much water. You make colors darker by using less water in watercolor. You can test it and make sure it's darker brown, kind of like the dark brown that we've used at the bottom there. Okay, now when we look at a tree and at eye level, and the eye level in this case is probably fairly low down on the trees, at eye level the markings will be straight, like that. Below eye level, the markings will start to change a little bit, and they'll begin to look more like that. Okay, they're curving just a little more. This is absolutely straight at eye level. Above eye level, they start to curve in the other direction until way at the top of the tree, they can be that sort of round. Now, by doing the markings like this and observing the perspective, the tree is going to look more dimensional. So this is our eye level here, where everything is always straight. Above eye level, they curve upwards. Below eye level, they curve downwards. Okay, so when you put your markings on the tree, you're going to be aware of doing that. Now let's see where we can figure out where the eye level is of the photographer. It's always the eye level of the photographer that we're looking at. And if we're standing back here, looks like he's standing just a little bit lower down. I would say probably about here. is the eye level. So it's low down on the trees. And so anything above about this area here is going to start curving. So we can choose a point. There's our eye level, and that's going to be a straight mark. Now the marks vary. They vary vertically, they vary horizontally, and they start to curve, and they're on the light side and they're on the dark side, and they go up the tree, and that makes a huge difference to make them curve like that. And as you go below your eye level, they start to curve the other way until down at the bottom there, they're curving quite a bit in the opposite direction. Okay, some of the markings will be on the light side, some of them will be on the dark side, and at the same time you can run a few little branches. Oftentimes the branches will be darker on these trees. You can run a few branches. We're going to use a little white paint for the white branches today. We could have scraped out some of them, but it's not quite as effective, but you could try that if you want to next time. You can scrape out a few of those. I'm just going to put a couple of the darker ones in to start with as we do this, and then we'll add some lighter ones in, just for this one from this side. Quite often the smaller, lower ones are horizontal, the lower branches, but more often than not, they're dark on birch trees, so not always light. So let's put the markings in, and remember you're going down with your arc and till you get to the eye level, and then everything goes up, okay, towards the eye level. And just a few, you don't need too many, and some of them are vertical, some of them are not. Just vary them. Just like anything else, they need to be varied. And then we'll work on the bottoms of the trees afterwards. Some of them can have fewer marks, some of them can have more marks. Just use a little brush calligraphy and make them interesting, so they're varied all the way around the tree. As soon as you add these marks to your trees, they become birch trees instantly. And the fact that you've made the dimension of the tree first means that they look round. Okay, there's our horizontal. So this needs to go down just a little bit, and this needs to go down a little bit more until we get to the bottom. And then we can have a little dark there, a little dark here. These can vary quite a bit as they go up. Space them out unevenly, not equally, so that they have the most interest that you can make on this tree. Just link a few of them together with some brown paint to give texture on the surface of the bark. And let's make this one the shining star, this one here, the big one. So we can give that a nice straight line there, down here. And as we go further up, we can have some nice larger marks on here, maybe here. So this is going to be more of our focal point in this painting. So you can push the size of the marks on this one and make them just a little bit bigger to make that happen. And I'm going to add some more darker branches as we go. Go back and do those in a second. We're also going to add some goodies down at the base. Usually these trees have darker bases, so I'll put a little bit of that in, and then we'll be almost finished with this one. It's take too much. It's amazing how little detail you need on these trees. Once you have the dimension, just a few marks will really pop them and make them look interesting. Okay, and once you've got enough marks on there, looking to me like I could use another one on that, then you're going to look at the base of the tree, and you're going to see that most of the time the base of these trees is dark, and the dark kind of goes up at the base of the tree like this and extends up a little bit and has a varied edge. So you can take your brush and you can go up like this on either side and just leave it open a little bit. And try and leave light against dark. So this is a darker, leave the edge of that one lighter so it doesn't, the two darks don't link together. So just pull up a little bit of dark at the base of each of these trees and make the bases interesting and different. They go into the snow in a different way. They don't have to be straight. This one can come down a bit more so that they feel more realistic. Just a little bit there, a little bit more on that one. Okay, now we have just a few more things to do to finish this off. As soon as you've got your markings in, go a wee bit darker on this. Right about there, just a bit darker on this one. Just a little bit darker on that one. Just on the outside edge there. Okay, now our trees are looking pretty good. So I'm going to add in a few more of the branches, the darker branches. Remember, do the front trees first because then you'll overlap in the correct way. Remember that if the tree is in front, the branches are going to go over the tree that's behind. Just watch for that. Sometimes that gets to be an issue. So this one, the branch will go behind this tree. Okay, very important that you watch for that. Okay, that one, branches can go over that way. And you can do as many branches as you like. When you get to the top of the tree, there are usually more branches, slightly fewer lower down. And this branch will go over the top of that tree in that direction. And a branch on this side would come over the top of the tree behind. Okay, a few more branches here. And then we'll add a few white ones in. For the top ones, I'm going to lighten them a little bit so they're not quite so dark and just run a few of them up into the sky from these background trees. You can overlap each other a little bit. Not quite so dark back there. Okay, that's probably going to be enough of those. And then we'll add just a few little white ones at the bottom here with the white paint. Take the white paint from the tube. Always keep it in the tube because it dries out too much. If you don't, put it onto the corner of your palette and just add a tiny little bit of water, enough to make it flow so it feels like cream. It's very creamy. Okay, and we can add in, once in a while, we see some lighter branches that go up like this. Just a little lighter one that goes up. Now when we put this on, it's going to be very bright and very white, but it's going to dry down darker. And so don't worry too much about it being too white. Maybe there'll be a little white one coming across here into the dark area. Let's use that light and dark to get some interest in these branches. Maybe a little white one coming across the darks here. And let's not use too many of these, just a few will be enough. That one goes behind. And they will all dry down just a little bit darker because that's what happens with the white paint. If they end up being a bit too bright when you've finished, what you can do is just to put a little shadow underneath them with the brown. But let's let them dry down first. That won't be an issue, I don't think. Okay, when you've got a few white branches in, mostly towards the bottom, then we're just going to finish off those shadows on the ground. And the shadows on the ground just need to have some darker tones. And that would be a darker version of the shadow color that you used, which was a blue-gray. So here's our shadow color down here. And I'm just going to use a slightly, that might be a little bit too dark, just a slightly darker version, that's better, of that color to accent these shadows down here. Let's just check and see. Yes, that's about right. Just a little darker in some of these. Not all of them, just some. Underline maybe some of those. They just need a little bit more of an accent. And maybe not quite so much down here, but maybe just a touch in a few places down here. Leave a little space because we're going to put in some grasses in there a little bit later, just before we finish. And just a little touch in there. So we've got a darker version of the shadows that we put in the first place. Let's extend that one out just a bit more so it makes more sense. Comes from the bottom of the tree and goes out just a wee bit more. Make sure they connect with the bottom of the tree. That's where they're coming from. Okay, that's good. Touch more here. And the very last thing that we're going to do, once we've done that, is the very last thing we're going to do is to add in some grasses here. Okay, so these little grasses we're going to use dark browns for. And let me just go over the way of painting grasses for you so you can remember this, right? It's very easy to get these looking a little too heavy. And so we use a little brush calligraphy for the grasses. And the way that works is that you don't want to paint your grasses like this. Okay, that's a no-no. What you do want to do is use a nice fine brush and keep your brush on the paper and connect the edges of the grasses and make them in clumps like that. They can be taller and varied, but they should be connected together in clumps, and they can go over an area that's rounded like that. And that has a much better appeal than this, okay? Much, much better. So this is what I call brush calligraphy. So let's have some brush calligraphy down here next to the tree in a brown. Let's go a little bit darker there, just a wee bit darker in that area. Next to the brown. We can have just a few back here. They get shorter, okay? As they go further back, they get smaller. And towards the front, they can be a lot taller. So let's put a little clump over here, going over the edge of that snow. Just a little bit of a clump of varied bush grasses there. Just a little bit back there. Maybe that one could be just a bit taller. And maybe just a few at the edge of the snow back there. But let's not overdo that. Let's be a little careful about putting too much in there. Okay, and that's about all you need in here. That should do it. Okay, I think we're just about done with this now. So let me just take the tape off and we'll take a look and see how it looks. The tape always gets in the way at the end of the painting because it's the wrong color for the painting. But it gives you an idea of what the colors are. So I hope you've enjoyed painting this birch forest with me today. And I'll just go back and explain how to finish off these little white areas before we finish. And just in case they got a little too strong, you can take a little brown paint and you can go right underneath them and just give them a little shadow. Okay, right underneath. And that would be the way to calm them down if they got just a little bit too light. So this one here, for example, I can put a little shadow right at the base and underneath. And for a larger painting, this would be a good way to fix these because they would look a little bit too odd just being completely white on a larger painting. So just a little tiny brown line underneath them will take care of that. Okay, and then they fit a lot better in the rest of the painting. It's a shadow, basically. That's what we've just added, is a shadow. So, okay, well, thank you for joining me today. Let me go back and talk to you again. And I hope you've enjoyed this painting. I hope you've learned a lot. Please apply it. Please try it again and move up in size if you want to, but be sure to move up your brushes as well. Make your brushes a little bit larger every time you move to a larger size painting. Okay, so I will say goodbye for now and look forward to seeing you again another time. Bye.